Good morning, everyone. Today, our report will focus on the fundamental concepts of obligation. We will explore what constitutes an obligation, its key elements, and the sources from which they arise. So, what is an obligation? According to Article 1156 of the Civil Code of the Philippines, obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. This definition highlights the legally binding nature of an obligation. It implies a duty or responsibility that is enforceable by law. The subsequent sections will clarify the different types of obligations and its implications. The first important term that is mentioned in the definition of an obligation is to give. So when we say to give, it is an obligation to deliver a specific or generic thing. For example, a contract for the sale of a unique piece of artwork. Therefore, the debtor has an obligation to deliver that specific painting, not just any painting of similar style. Next is to do. It is an obligation to perform a specific act or service. For example, a contractor's obligation to build a house. So the specific service or act there is building a house. And the last one is not to do. When we say not to do or forbearance, it is an obligation to refrain from doing such act. For example, a person promised not to sue someone in exchange for payment. Therefore, the person who made that promise is obligated to refrain from doing legal action.
Delict is an act committed by a person that causes harm to another person intentionally, and it leads to oblige to pay damage costs.
There are 5 sources of obligation. As stipulated in the Article 1157, obligation arises from law, contract, quasi-contracts, delicts, quasi-delicts. Law. The law of obligation refers to a person's legal duty to do something. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Filipino resident who tested positive for the coronavirus had a legal obligation to self-isolate at home, with those who refused to follow the rules liable to pay a fine if caught. Contract. Contract is agreement between parties that create binding obligation, such as employment contract, lease agreement, or sales contract. Next is quasi-contract. This is also called a contract implied in law or constructive contract. This means that agreement created by the court system and imposed by a judge. There are 2 types of quasi-contract. First is negotiatorium gestio, when a person voluntarily takes charge of another business or property without permission. Second is solutio indebiti. It means that when a person mistaken gives something to another who is not entitled to receive it, creating an obligation to return it. So, example, when a person mistaken pay another debt, believing it was their own, and the receipt of the payment is the obligated to return it, even though there was no formal agreement. Now, let's differentiate quasi-contract versus contract. Quasi-contract only implied in law, ordered by a judge. No contract exists, while contract can be expressed or implied, can be initiated by a party agreement, and legal contract exists. Thank you.
Pure obligation. A pure obligation is not subject to any condition or period. They are immediately demandable. The characteristics of a pure obligation is that there are no conditions, no term, and no immediate demandability. One of an example or example scenario of a pure obligation is that Carl borrows money from Dave and promises to repay immediately. Since there are no terms or conditions, Dave may demand payment from Carl at any time. And another scenario is that Queen agrees to deliver a certain quantity of goods to Erika without a specific any date. This constitutes a pure obligation as Erika can immediately demand delivery. Thank you.
And the second obligation of kinds of obligation is the conditional obligations. Means fulfillment depends on future event. And there is two types of conditional obligations, which is first is suspensive. Obligation arises upon fulfillment. For example is I will give you a car, but if you pass the bar exam, that is suspensive. And the second is resolutory. Obligation is extinguished upon fulfillment. For example, I will let you live in my house until you get married. That is resolutory. That is conditional obligations.
Obligations with a period. Obligation with a period or obligation with a term means an obligation whose fulfillment or demandability is contingent upon the arrival of a specific time or event. In other words, it is where a duty is said to be expected or to be fulfilled upon the arrival of a future event. Then we have the difference between a period and a condition. The difference between the two depends on their certainty. A period is a future certain event which has a specific date that is certain to occur or to happen, while a condition is a future uncertain event which means is undetermined even whether to happen.
Types of periods are the kinds of terms. First is the suspensive or the ex-die, a term or a period with a suspensive effect. Suspensive means something is waiting to happen or be decided and you're not sure what will happen next. But we're talking about obligation, which means obligation becomes effectively only from the arrival of a certain day. For example, Joey promises to support Rachel from the death of Rachel's father, which means the obligation will begins from the death of Rachel's father, and who knows when and what will happen next, right? Second is the resolutory or the indiem, a term or a period with a resolutory effect, which means the obligation will subsist up to a certain day and will terminate upon the arrival of that day. For example, Joey promises to support Rachel reaches her majority age, which means the obligation is already effective but will terminate once Rachel turns 18. So, just remember this, guys. When we talk about suspensive, it's like waiting to happen. And when we talk about resolutory, it's like problem solved. That's all, and thank you.
Article 1192 Civil Code of the Philippines Alternative Obligations. In alternative obligations, the debtor is obliged to perform one of several prestations, and the fulfillment of any one of them is sufficient to extinguish the obligations. So, alternative obligations is when a person promises to do out of several things and just doing one is enough to fulfill the promise. Like for example, I told my friend that I will give her my jacket or my extra t-shirt tomorrow. Then the next day, I give my jacket to her. So I don't need to give my extra t-shirt anymore because I already give one of the two things that I promised.
A facultative obligation, or the Civil Code of the Philippines, Article 1206, is the type of obligation in which the debtor is primarily required to fulfill a specific prestation. but has the right to substitute it with another performance. The choice to substitute lies with the debtor unless otherwise agreed upon. For example, Lisa borrows 10,000 from Mark and promised to repay him in cash. However, their agreement allows Lisa the option to settle the debt by giving Mark her laptop instead. So the primary obligation of Lisa is to give Mark the 10,000 in cash. And the laptop is the optional substitute, meaning Lisa can choose to give it instead, but Mark cannot demand it.